The first thing you noticed, driving up County Road 19 outside a small farm town in the high desert of New Mexico, was the glare.
Okay, the numbers work.
A field that should have held
Reposition the
chili
crane by
plants
gate
or
4 before
alfalfa
noon, then we can
instead
start
held
loading.
row after row of glass, tilted at the sun, throwing light back at the sky like the ground itself had cracked open. And somewhere in the middle of that glare, more often than not, there was a small brown and white goat, flat on her side, sound asleep,
That crack goes
as if
deep,
she
Ren.
owned the
I don't
place.
know if that'll hold.
She sort of did. This is the story of how Ren Adler paid off a farm's electric bill by dragging home other people's garbage, 5,000 pieces of it, and how a goat named Amp ended up with the best sun deck in 3 counties. Ren Adler was 28 when she came home. She'd been going to school for something in logistics, in Albuquerque, with a job lined up at a distribution company that folded before she ever started. And rather than sit in a city paying rent she didn't have a reason for anymore, she drove 2 hours south to the family farm outside a small town in Doña Ana County. In the flat scrubland between the Rio Grande and the Organ Mountains, where her father Emmett Adler had grown chili, onions, and a little alfalfa for 40 years, and her mother Lena kept the books, the chickens, and, most days, the peace between the two of them. Emmett was 61, proud, and tired, in the specific way of a man who has fixed the same pump twice in one season. The farm wasn't failing because of drought, or bad soil, or bad luck with the crop. It was failing, slowly and predictably, because of one line item, the bill from Rio Grande Electric Co-op. The well pump ran nearly around the clock in summer, pulling water up from 300 feet to flood irrigate 11 acres under a sun that did not quit from May to October. The walk-in cooler ran 24 hours a day because chili and onions do not wait politely for you to get around to selling them. Between the two, the Adlers were paying the co-op more some months than they cleared at the farmer's market. Emmett had made his peace with it the way you make peace with a bad hip. Ren had not. "There's nothing to be done about the sun, Ren," Emmett told her, more than once, in the tone of a man ending a conversation. "Costs what it costs." It was Ren who noticed the flatbed trucks. She'd taken a part-time job doing deliveries for a feed store 2 towns over, in part because the farm couldn't pay her a real wage yet, and on her route she started passing a solar installation company's yard, where pallets of panels sat stacked under tarps, and a sign in front that said, plainly, "Free, take as many as you want." She stopped, eventually, because her truck needed gas money and free was free. What she learned, standing in that yard talking to a bored guy named Dale who ran the warehouse, cracked something open in her head. "Solar panels get thrown away constantly," he told her, "and hardly any of it is because they're actually dead. A hailstorm cracks a corner of the glass, and the installer can't in good conscience sell it as new, so it's pulled. A panel is 10 or 12 years old, and a company doing a big commercial upgrade rips out an entire field of older, lower wattage panels to put in fewer, more efficient ones. Not because the old ones stopped working, but because newer ones make more power per square foot, and the economics favor a wholesale swap. A single cell in a 60-cell panel fails, and drags down the rating enough that it fails a warranty inspection. None of that, Dale said, means the panel makes zero power. Most of it, he said, means the panel makes almost exactly what it always did, and nobody wants to deal with sorting the junk from the merely blemished, so all of it gets called junk. There was, it turned out, a decommissioned utility-scale solar field about 40 minutes south too, an old field being upgraded, dumping pallet after pallet of 10 and 15-year-old panels that had been running fine until someone decided newer ones would run better. Ren stood in that yard doing the math out loud, badly, on her phone. The farm was paying the co-op an average of $900 a month, more in summer. The panels in front of her were free. The sun over the farm was, and had always been, completely free and completely relentless. New Mexico's high desert gets nearly triple the sunny days of a lot of the country, and everyone on that farm had spent their whole lives complaining about it. She looked at Dale and said, "Can I take a truckload?" She took 4 truckloads that first week. Emmett came out to see what she was hauling and stood at the tailgate for a long moment, taking in cracked glass, dented frames, and a peeling sticker on one panel that said, "Inspected," "Rejected," and said, "Wren." What in the hell is this? It's the power bill, Dad. I'm going to go get the power bill and bring it home in pieces. He did not find this reassuring. Over the following months, it became something the whole area had opinions about. Wren kept driving, kept hauling, kept stacking panels along the back field in long rows under tarps, until the tarps ran out and she just stacked them in the sun, since the sun wasn't going to hurt them any worse than it already had. Word got around the way things get around in a small farm town. Somebody mentioned it at the feed store. Somebody mentioned it at church. And pretty soon trucks slowed down on the county road just to look at the field, which by the second summer held some 5,000 salvaged panels, glinting like a lake that had frozen mid-splash. Cyrus Beltran, who farmed the section across the road and had known Wren since she was small enough to be a nuisance in his squash patch, took to leaning on the fence whenever she was out there and needling her. "You planting glass now, Wren? How's that crop coming?" "Harvest in about 2 years, Cyrus. I'll save you a watt." "Your daddy know you're running a junkyard?" "My daddy knows exactly what I'm running. He just hasn't decided if he's proud or embarrassed yet." Emmett, for the record, had decided. He thought his daughter had lost her mind, gently and without malice, the way you'd worry about a kid building a raft in the driveway. He didn't stop her, mostly because Lena told him not to, and partly because the panels were free, and the only thing they were costing him was pride and yard space, of which the farm had plenty of both to spare. The goat had no opinion on any of this, except that the field was warm. Amp was a pygmy goat, small, brown and white, bossy beyond all proportion to her size, who had been acquired 2 years earlier as a companion animal for a horse that had since died, leaving Amp in sole possession of the farm's affections and most of its patience. The moment the first row of panels went in, angled south, tilted up off the ground on cinder blocks, holding the sun's heat all day and into the evening, Amp discovered what she plainly considered the single greatest architectural achievement in the history of the farm: a heated, glass-topped, perfectly goat-sized platform, built, she seemed to believe, entirely for her. She claimed it immediately. She slept flat on her side, across 2 panels at a time, and if anyone came to work on her array, she headbutted them in the shin as a formal objection before allowing it. Every new row Wren installed, Amp treated as a territorial expansion, strutting the length of it like a landlord doing an inspection. The trouble was that Wren didn't actually know how to do any of this yet. She was not an electrician. Nobody in her life was an electrician. There was no wise old man with a folder of wiring diagrams waiting to save her, no cousin who did this professionally, nobody at the co-op willing to do anything but sell her more power. What she had was a library card, a laptop, and, eventually, a set of off-grid solar forums populated by strangers with names like Off-Grid Ollie and Solar Salvage and Desert Watson, who argued with each other at all hours about wire gauge and charge controllers with the fervor other people reserve for religion. She read until 2 in the morning most nights that first winter, posting questions, getting half answers, getting into actual arguments with Off-Grid Ollie about whether her plan would work at all, and slowly, badly, she started to learn. Her first real mistake came fast, and it was almost funny in retrospect, though it did not feel that way at the time. She wired up the first 40 panels she'd hauled home into a simple series string, on the very reasonable assumption that if a panel had survived the drive home and didn't have glass sticking out of it, it probably worked fine. She ran the wires to a cheap charge controller and a single car battery she'd borrowed from the farm truck, threw the switch, and got almost nothing. A trickle. Not enough to charge a phone twice. It took her most of a week of forum threads to understand why. Not every panel that looks fine is fine. Some had failed silently. A moisture-damaged junction box, a cracked cell you couldn't see without looking close, an internal connection corroded to nothing. And because she'd wired them in series, one bad panel didn't just fail to contribute. It dragged the whole string down with it, because in a series string, the current is limited by the weakest link. same as old Christmas lights. The forums were blunt about the fix, and Off-Grid Ollie in particular had no patience for shortcuts. You test every single panel, one at a time, in full sun, before it goes anywhere near your array. You use a multimeter to check its open circuit voltage, the voltage across the terminals with nothing connected, which tells you the panel's basically alive, and then its short circuit current, briefly touching the leads together through the meter, which tells you it can actually deliver power and isn't just holding a dead charge like a battery with nothing behind it. A panel rated for 36 volts open circuit that's reading 4 volts in full noon sun is not a panel with a scratch. It's a panel with a body. So she tested. All 5,000 of them, eventually, over the better part of 2 years, one at a time, sitting in a folding chair in the backfield with a clipboard and a multimeter, and, more often than not, a goat asleep 6 feet away, radiating disapproval whenever the testing process required moving a panel she'd claimed as bedding. What she found surprised her more than the testing itself. A huge number of the dead panels weren't dead at all. Many had a blown bypass diode in the junction box, a small component, worth a couple of dollars, that's meant to route current around a shaded or damaged section of cells so it doesn't become a bottleneck, and that fails from age or a lightning-induced power surge far more often than the actual solar cells do. Swap the diode, and a panel that had been reading almost nothing suddenly tested at full output. Others had corroded MC4 connectors, the little weatherproof plugs the wires terminate in, gone green and crusty from years outdoors, which she learned to snip off and replace with new ones for a few dollars a pair. She started keeping 2 piles, truly dead, which was a small pile, mostly panels with shattered cells or scorched backing sheets, and fixable, which was a large pile, sometimes just needing a $5 part and 20 minutes with a soldering iron. She resurrected, by her own rough count, a little over 3,000 panels that everyone else had already written off as trash. Her second real failure came once she had panels she trusted, and it was a lesson in a different direction entirely. She wired a new string using whatever tested panels were closest at hand, without checking that they matched, and ended up with a string containing 2 175-watt panels she'd pulled from the utility field, and a scattering of 100-watt panels from the installer's yard. The string produced next to nothing useful. Again, not because anything was broken this time, but because a series string runs at the current of its weakest member, full stop. Wire 5 strong panels and 1 weak one in series, and you don't get 4 strong and 1 weak, you get 6 weak. She learned, reading and rereading a forum thread until it finally sank in, the basic grammar of the whole trade. Wiring panels in series adds their voltages together while the current stays capped at the lowest panel in that string, and wiring panels in parallel adds their currents together while the voltage stays at whatever the panels are rated for. And if you want an array that behaves itself, you group panels of matching voltage and wattage into strings, and you don't mix a 15-year-old 175-watt commercial panel with a 5-year-old 100-watt residential one and expect them to cooperate. She spent a weekend resorting her fixable pile by wattage and voltage rating, marking each with paint pen, and rewired the strings clean. The third failure nearly cooked itself in front of her. Flush with a working array of a few dozen panels, she ran the output back to the barn using whatever wire she had lying around, some of it lighter gauge than she should have used, over a run of nearly 80 feet. The wire got warm to the touch under load, not sparking, not dramatic, just warm in a way that made the hair on her arms stand up, and she was pulling far less power at the battery end than the panels were putting out at the array end. Voltage drop, the forums told her, is a real cost, not just a theoretical one. Push current through wire that's too thin for the distance and the amperage, and you lose real, measurable power to heat along the way. The same way water pressure drops in a garden hose that's too narrow for how far you're pushing it. The fix, she learned, wasn't only about buying thicker copper, though she did that too. It was about voltage itself. A 12-volt battery system moving the same wattage as a 48-volt system has to carry 4 times the current to do it. And current, not voltage, is what makes wire heat up and lose power over distance. Bump the system to 48 volts, and you can move the same power through wire a fraction of the thickness, with a fraction of the loss. She tore out her 12-volt plan and rebuilt around a 48-volt battery bank, and the difference showed up immediately on her meter. Wires that stayed cool, and power that actually arrived where she was sending it. Cyrus, leaning on the fence through most of this, was a font of unhelpful commentary. "Ren Adler," he said one evening, watching her wrap a fresh splice in electrical tape by headlamp, "your granddaddy grew chili on this land for 50 years and never once needed a soldering iron. My granddaddy also never had a $900 power bill in July, Cyrus. Times change. Times ought not to require this much cussing. That's just called learning." She was learning, but the lesson that nearly ended the whole thing wasn't one she found in a forum thread. It found her. By the fall of her second year, Ren had a decent-sized working array powering some shop lights and a chest freezer in the barn, cobbled together with growing confidence and, she'd admit later, flatly, with no pride in it, not nearly enough respect for what she was actually working with. She hadn't installed proper fuses at the array. She hadn't put in a DC disconnect switch, which is exactly what it sounds like, a way to cut the whole array off from the wiring quickly and safely. She figured, the way people figure when nothing bad has happened yet, that she'd get to it. One evening in October, a length of wire she'd run along a shelf edge in the barn chafed through its insulation against a metal bracket, and two conductors that should never have touched. It shorted. In a household AC circuit, a short like that usually pops a breaker in a heartbeat, and the story ends there. Direct current from a solar array doesn't behave that politely. Because the sun keeps pushing current through that connection continuously, and because there was no fuse, no breaker, nothing standing between the array and the wire, the short didn't just spark and stop. It arced, a sustained blue-white electrical arc that doesn't self-extinguish the way an AC short usually does, and that arc is hot enough to ignite anything nearby almost instantly. Insulation caught, then a stack of feed sacks against the wall caught. Within a minute there was real fire climbing the shelf toward the barn's old wood rafters, and Ren, who'd walked in to check on a battery reading, spent the longest 30 seconds of her life finding the garden hose and getting it on the flames before they reached the roof. She got it out. The barn survived with a scorched wall and a ruined shelf, and a smell that took weeks to air out. Ren did not survive it so easily. She sat on the ground outside afterward, hands shaking, and cried, which she was not in the habit of doing in front of her parents, and Emmett came out and sat down next to her in the dirt, and didn't say "I told you so," which she noted, later, was the kindest thing he could have done in that moment, and also the thing that told her how scared he'd actually been. He did say, once she'd stopped shaking, "That's the end of it, Ren. I mean that." For a few days, it nearly was. She'd read about DC arcing in passing on the forums, and had filed it away as the kind of thing that happened to careless people. She had been the careless person. She understood now, in a way no comment thread had made land, that array-level voltage isn't a toy, that a solar system without proper fusing, breakers, disconnects, and grounding isn't a shortcut, it's a fire that hasn't happened yet. What changed Emmett's mind, in the end, wasn't Ren's confidence. It was her fear. He recognized, watching her spend the next several nights reading building code threads instead of going to bed, that she wasn't going to walk away from this scared and unfinished, and that the safer path forward was to make sure she didn't do the rest of it alone. That was how Frank Ozuna came into it. Frank was a licensed electrician who did commercial work out of Las Cruces, semi-retired, taking farm and ranch jobs on the side, because he liked the drive out into open country. Lena found him through a woman at church whose barn he'd rewired the year before. He came out, looked at the scorched wall, looked at Ren's array with its bare splices and no disconnect and no fuses anywhere in sight, and said, without much drama, "This would have killed somebody eventually. Might have been you." Ren didn't argue with him. She told him what she'd built and why, panel by panel, and Frank, who had clearly expected to find an amateur playing with fire, and instead found someone who'd taught herself the difference between series and parallel wiring, and had a genuine, working understanding of why the fire had happened, softened noticeably over the course of that first afternoon. "You did the hard part already," he told her. "You understand it. You just skip the part that keeps it from killing you." He didn't do the work for her. He worked alongside her, over the following months, rebuilding the system from the panels up, and made her explain each decision back to him before he'd let her move to the next. Every string got its own fuse, sized to the string's expected current, so a fault in one string couldn't cascade into the rest of the array. A DC disconnect switch went in between the array and the battery bank, so the whole system could be cut dead by hand in seconds. The array frame and every metal component got tied to a grounding rod driven into the caliche, so a fault would have somewhere safe to go instead of through a person or a fire. He replaced her scavenged, no-name charge controller with a real MPRT unit, maximum power point tracking, he explained, meaning the controller constantly adjusts itself to pull the most possible power out of the panels at any given moment, even converting excess panel voltage into extra charging current, instead of her old cheap PWM controller, which had simply been throwing away a good third of what the panels could produce, because it could only pass voltage straight through at whatever the battery happened to want. Ren made one more expensive mistake in that stretch, and it stuck with her worse than the fire in some ways because it was so avoidable. Eager to test the rebuilt system, she ran her new battery bank down hard, night after night, running shop lights and the freezer well past what the forums had warned her a lead-acid bank could take, and killed it, permanently, inside of 4 months. Depth of discharge, she learned the expensive way, isn't a suggestion. Draining a lead-acid bank much past 50% regularly shortens its life dramatically, sometimes ruining it outright, the way running a car engine with no oil doesn't kill it today but kills it soon. The fix wasn't just gentler habits. It was sizing the battery bank properly in the first place, big enough that the loads she actually ran only ever pulled it down a safe, shallow amount before the panels topped it back up the next day. She bought a bigger bank, this time engineered for the load instead of guessed at, and treated it, from then on, like something that owed her money. Frank came out one last time that winter, walked the whole rebuilt system with a checklist, tested the grounding, checked every fuse rating against its wire gauge, and signed a piece of paper saying it was safe. It was, Ren said later, the single proudest piece of paper she owned. From there, growth came the way real growth comes, which is to say, slowly, and only because each step actually worked before the next one was attempted. The rebuilt array, by that point a little over 60 kilowatts across roughly 900 installed panels, the rest still sat in the back field awaiting testing and repair, went first to the well pump, since that was the single largest and most predictable drain on the farm. It worked. The pump ran all summer on rescued sunlight, and the co-op bill for irrigation dropped to nearly nothing. Once that held for a full season without a hiccup, she expanded the array and moved the walk-in cooler onto it, which mattered even more to Emmett than the pump did, because he'd spent 30 years watching a bad power day threaten a week's worth of chile. Then the barn's lights and equipment. Then, in the spring of the 3rd year, with the array grown to just over 2,000 tested and repaired panels, and the battery bank size to match, the house itself came off the grid. The number that finally got everyone's attention, including Cyrus's, was the one printed on the co-op's own paper, the Adler Farms power bill, which had run as high as $1,100 in a bad July, read 0. Not low, 0. They kept the account open for the first several months out of nervousness, in case of a long stretch of cloud, but the batteries and the sheer size of the array carried them through every gray week that came, and eventually, Emmett drove into the co-op office himself and closed the account, which Lena said was the happiest she'd seen him look in about a decade. Cyrus held out on the subject for exactly as long as pride allowed, which turned out to be until his own July bill came in. He showed up at the fence one evening, hands in his pockets, and said, without much preamble, All right. Teach me. Teach you what, Cyrus? How to plant glass? Don't. I'm just saying, you had opinions. I still have opinions. I'd just like to also have your electric bill. She helped him build his own array from salvaged panels that spring, working through his field the same way she'd worked through her own. Testing, sorting, fixing bad diodes and corroded connectors, matching strings by wattage, fusing everything properly from the very first day, because some lessons you only need to learn once if the lesson is a barn fire. His grandson, Marco, 16 and endlessly curious, had been hanging around the Adler place for months by then, ever since he'd wandered over one afternoon to see what the noise was and ended up handing Ren tools for 3 hours without being asked. He turned out to have a genuine feel for it, patient with the testing in a way most people weren't, and Ren started paying him a little to help, which was less about the labor and more about not having to explain everything twice to the next farmer who wanted one. And there started being a next farmer, and then another. Word moves fast in farm country once there's a number attached to it, and 0 is a very persuasive number. Ren started getting calls. Could she come look at somebody's field? Could she help somebody figure out what size battery bank they'd need? Could she teach somebody's kid to test panels? She never advertised. She didn't need to. Within a year, she was doing 2 or 3 small system builds a season for neighboring farms, charging enough to matter without ever pretending it was the point, and Marco, by then, could test and repair a panel about as fast as she could. Amp, through all of this, remained entirely unmoved by the scale of the operation, except insofar as it kept expanding her real estate. By the time the array reached the house, she had claimed something like 40 panels as her personal domain, sunbathing flat across the warm glass most afternoons, headbutting Marco with real conviction the first several times he came near her, rose before eventually, grudgingly, allowing him tenant status. Late one evening that second autumn, with the co-op meter long gone and the house lit up warm against the dark, Emmett walked out to the porch and stood looking at it. The windows lit, the pump humming faintly out past the barn, the whole place running on sunlight that other people had thrown away. And Lena came out and stood next to him, and after a while he said, mostly to himself, "Never thought garbage would look this good lit up." Ren, coming up the porch steps behind them, heard it and didn't say anything smart back, which for her was practically a eulogy of praise. Out past the porch light, in the dark, Amp lay stretched flat across a row of warm glass, fast asleep, looking, as she had from the very first panel, entirely certain that all of it, the testing, the fires, the fuses, the 5,000 pieces of scrap glass and metal, had been built, from the beginning, for exactly this. If you like this one, hit subscribe for more stories like it. And tell us in the comments about something everyone around you called worthless that turned out to be worth a fortune.